There's a moment, and most men who have lived past 40 will know the one I mean, when you're standing at the edge of a decision that has no good side. Not a hard decision. Hard decisions have a right answer buried somewhere inside them, and the work is just digging it out. I mean the other kind. The kind where both roads lead somewhere painful, and the only question is whose pain you're willing to carry home. I've spent 31 years keeping a field log. Not a diary, I want to be clear about that distinction, because my brother Emmett never let me forget he found it once and called it a diary in front of our father. A field log, observations, measurements, weather patterns. The kind of record a man keeps when he needs proof that what he saw was real, because the human mind has a way of smoothing out the edges of things it doesn't understand. I logged the wolf that limped into our camp in the winter of '71 and slept 3 feet from the fire like it had earned the right. I logged the flood that took the Jensen homestead and left a single rocking chair sitting upright in the middle of a field, perfectly dry. I logged what happened at Cutter's Ford in the September of 1883, when a woman whose name I didn't learn until the second day walked out of the dark with a child on her back and said 4 words that changed the shape of every assumption I had carried my entire life. I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I understand it now. But I wrote it down. Every word, every hour, every choice that was made and unmade in the space of a single night that somehow stretched long enough to hold a lifetime's worth of consequence. What you're about to read is not a story about Apache people being noble or savage, or anything the newspapers would have you believe. It is not a story about a cowboy being a hero. It is a story about 2 people, both of them tired, both of them scared, both of them carrying something too heavy for one person, meeting at the exact moment when neither of them had anything left to lose. I have never written this account for publication. I've written it here because I am 62 years old and my hands shake in the mornings now, and if I don't get it down while the details are still sharp, they'll die with me. And some things shouldn't die with the man who saw them. The woman at the edge of the water. Field log, Cutter's Ford, Arizona Territory, September 14, 1883. Temperature at dusk, warm enough to sweat through your shirt but cool enough to make you regret it by midnight. Wind, southwest intermittent, moon 3/4 mostly useful. Personal condition, exhausted right boot developing a blister on the lateral heel, disposition uncertain. The child made no sound. That was the first thing I noticed, and I noticed it because it was wrong in the way that only a man who has been around children long enough knows something is wrong. Children cry, children fuss. Children announce their misery to the open sky with a kind of democratic enthusiasm that suggests they have never once considered suffering in silence as an option. This child, small enough that her head barely cleared the woman's left shoulder, wrapped in a piece of wool cloth the color of dried creek mud, made no sound. She was awake. Her eyes were open. I could see the moonlight catching in them from 30 feet away, 2 small bright points like struck flint. But she was silent in the deliberate way of something that has learned silence is a survival tool, and that understanding settled into my chest like a cold stone. I was sitting on the north bank of Cutter's Ford, which is what the locals called the Shallow, crossing on the Salt Fork, where the water runs knee-deep over flat sandstone most of the year. I was supposed to be 12 miles west, camped with the Delacroix survey crew, but a disagreement with my horse, which I will not detail here except to say that the animal's opinion of loose shale descents differed substantially from mine, and one of us ended up walking had put me at the ford by accident, alone, with a fire I probably shouldn't have built, and a tin of beans I was most of the way through. I heard her before I saw her, or rather I heard the water change. There's a sound a person makes when they enter a crossing that's different from the sound an animal makes. A deer pushes through water with a kind of mechanical confidence. A person wades. There's hesitation in it, a testing of each step. I'd learned that distinction somewhere between my first cattle drive and my third, and my hand was on the grip of my rifle before I'd finished the thought. Then she came into the firelight. She was Apache, or so I thought immediately, based on the cut of her clothing and the style of her moccasins and the particular way she held herself, which was not submissive and not aggressive, but something more precise than either, careful, like a woman who has learned to exist in the space between other people's fear and her own. She was perhaps 30, perhaps older. It was hard to tell by firelight, and I have always been terrible at guessing age in anyone, a fact my field log can confirm across numerous embarrassing entries. She was soaking wet from the thighs down. The child on her back was not wet. She'd carried the girl above the waterline across the entire ford. She stopped at the edge of my fire's reach and looked at me, and I looked at her, and we stayed like that for a moment that felt much longer than it was. I am aware, in retrospect, that I was the one with the rifle. I am aware that the calculus of danger in that moment was not what my instincts were telling me it was. But awareness and instinct are different animals, and mine was coiled and ready. She spoke. I didn't understand the words. My Apache was essentially non-existent. I could count to 3 and ask for water and mispronounce both, but the tone was not hostile. It was something more stripped down than that. Something that had passed exhaustion a while back and come out the other side into a register that was almost calm. She said something else, shorter, and then in English that was careful and deliberate and constructed with the attention of someone who had learned it as a working tool rather than a native tongue. She said, "One night is all I ask." I didn't move. "My daughter," she said, and her chin tilted slightly toward the child on her back. "She needs warmth and to not move." I looked at the child again, those unmoving eyes. "What's wrong with her?" I said, and my voice came out lower than I intended, which I think was its own kind of instinct, the way you speak quietly around something fragile. The woman's expression shifted in a way I didn't have vocabulary for then and still struggle to describe now. It wasn't grief exactly. It was more like grief had already been and gone, and what remained was the shape it left behind. "She has been sick," she said. 3 days walking, I need her to stop moving." 3 days walking. I looked at the woman's feet. Her moccasins were worn through on the right heel, and there was dried blood on the ankle above it. I looked at her hands, which were not shaking but were gripping the child's legs with a steadiness that was clearly costing her something. I looked at her face, which was, and I am writing this in my field log where I do not permit myself flattering revisions, not what I expected to see on the face of someone who had just crossed a river at night with a sick child. It was the face of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and was now simply executing it. I put the rifle down. Not flat on the ground, I set it against the rock beside me within reach because I was 31 years old and not completely foolish. But I put it down. "Sit down," I said. "There's room." She crossed the remaining distance to the fire without hurrying, which told me something about her. A person in the grip of relief usually shows it in their legs. She showed nothing. She lowered herself to the ground with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been managing a heavy load for so long they've stopped thinking about it as a burden and started thinking of it as just the shape of their body. And she unwrapped the child from her back and settled the girl against her side. I got my bedroll, the only one I had, and I pushed it toward her without speaking. She looked at it, then at me. "For the girl," I said. Something moved through her face then. Not gratitude, exactly, or not only gratitude. It was more complicated than that. I wrote in my log that night that it looked like what a person looks like when they've been braced for a blow and the blow doesn't come. That particular recalibration of the body when the worst thing doesn't happen. She wrapped the child in the bedroll. I moved around to the other side of the fire and opened my saddlebag for the second tin of beans and the piece of hardtack I'd been saving for breakfast, and I put them on the flat rock near the fire. I did not offer them directly. I did not say here, "Eat this," or anything that would require her to accept something from me out loud. I just put them there and looked at the fire instead. A minute passed. 2. Then I heard the small sound of the tin being opened. I wrote that down too. Her name, and I learned this by the 3rd hour of the night, in increments. The way you learn anything real about a person was Tsehane. She told me what it meant in English when I asked, which was an act of either trust or testing, and I wasn't sure which. Woman who carries the season. She said her grandmother had given it to her because she'd been born during the first frost and had not cried once. "Did you," I asked, "cry?" "I was a baby," she said. "I don't remember." "That's not what I asked." The ghost of something crossed her face. "My grandmother said no," she said. "She may have been lying. Grandmothers make things elegant." I laughed. I hadn't expected to laugh, and the sound came out rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened recently. The child's name was Nolly. She was 6 years old. She had developed a fever 4 days earlier at their camp north of the canyon system. Camp that no longer existed, Sehane said, in the tone people use when they're describing a fact rather than a wound, though it was clearly both. I did not press her on why. I had enough general knowledge of the territory in 1883 to understand that camp that no longer exists carried a freight of specific meaning. I had no right to demand she unpack for a stranger at a fire. Nolly had the fever, she said. It had broken partially 2 days ago, but come back. She was eating, barely. She needed to lie still. "Where are you going?" I asked. Sehane stirred the fire with a stick, not because it needed stirring, but because it gave her hands something to do, which I recognized as a nervous habit I shared almost exactly. "There is a family," she said. 2 days south, they know my family. They will take Nolly." "Take her." "Keep her safe," she said. "Keep her fed." A pause long enough to have an architecture. "I cannot keep her safe, and I cannot keep her fed, and I cannot stop walking long enough for the fever to leave her." I looked at the child. Nolly was asleep now. Finally, one small fist curled against her mouth. Her breathing was audible, not labored, but present in a way that made you track it. "And then what?" I said. "After you leave her with this family?" Sehane set the stick down and looked at the fire. "Then I go back," she said. I waited. "There are others," she said, "from our camp who did not get to come south with me." I turned this over. The implications of it were not difficult to follow if you had any knowledge at all of what was happening in the territory. The movements, the displacement, the systematic pressure on every Apache community that hadn't already been pushed onto the reservation. I had that knowledge. I'd tried not to think about it in political terms because I was a surveyor, not a soldier and not a politician. And the convenient fiction I'd permitted myself was that the land I helped map was politically neutral. That fiction was harder to maintain. Sitting there with a woman who'd walked 3 days with a sick child through country I'd been hired to document. "Why did you stop here?" I asked. "There are settlers south of the ford, closer to the road." "Yes," she said. I waited again. "The man at the last farm," she said carefully, "told me to leave before he finished speaking the sentence." She did not say this with bitterness. She said it with the precision of someone reporting a data point. "I thought about that. I thought about it for a while." "How'd you know I wouldn't?" I said. Sehane looked at me for the first time since she'd sat down, really looked. The way you look at something you're trying to read rather than just observe. "I didn't," she said. "But you were alone. Alone men are sometimes different from men with other men watching." That observation sat in my chest like an ember. I wrote it down later, verbatim, with an asterisk. Nolly made a small sound in her sleep and turned her head. Sehane was at her side before the sound finished, her hand on the girl's forehead, her lips moving in something low and rhythmic that might have been a prayer or might have been a song or might have been the kind of thing that is both. I turned back to the fire and let her have that moment without my eyes in it. The night was warm. Somewhere in the creek brush to the east, something moved small, probably a ringtail or a kangaroo rat making its rounds. The fire had settled into its reliable middle-distance stage, steady and generous and not asking anything of anyone. I opened my field log to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote the date. Then I sat there for a while with the pencil in my hand, trying to find the right first sentence for something I didn't yet understand well enough to describe. Around midnight, Nolly woke up. Not gradually. Children don't wake gradually when they're running a fever. She came up out of sleep fast and disoriented, and for a moment she looked at the fire and then at me, and the sound she made was not crying exactly but the precursor to it, that single loaded intake of breath before the decision. Sehane spoke to her immediately, quiet and continuous, and the sound never resolved into crying. The girl looked at her mother's face, and the intake of breath became just breathing again, and she put her head back down against Sehane's shoulder. But she looked at me. Not with fear or not primarily with fear. With the particular attention children give to things they haven't categorized yet. I was an uncategorized thing. "Hi," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. Nolly looked at her mother, then back at me. She said something short, a question by the sound of it. "She asks who you are," Sehane said. "Tell her I'm a man who got lost," I said. Sehane translated. Nolly considered this, then she said something else. She says, Sehane said, with a cadence I couldn't read, that she has never been lost, but she has been turned around. That's a real distinction, I said. Yes, Sehane said. She makes real distinctions. The girl was watching me with those flat stone eyes that had seen something. I didn't know what specifically, but something that had evacuated a certain kind of childhood innocence that 6-year-olds are supposed to still have. Looking at her made my chest hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. I fidgeted with my pencil. I am a known fidgeter. The field log is full of references to this. Tell her she can sleep, I said. Nobody's going anywhere. Sehane spoke softly. The girl's eyes stayed on me for another moment. Then she closed them. She was asleep again in 4 minutes. I timed it because I was writing things down and the time felt relevant. Sehane stayed awake. I didn't ask her to sleep because I understood she wouldn't, and asking would have been a kind of condescension I didn't have the right to. She sat with her daughter and the fire between us burned lower, and I added a piece of mesquite and we watched it catch. You write things down, she said, looking at my log. Yes. What do you write? Whatever I see, I said. Whatever seems true. She was quiet for a moment. And what did you write tonight? I looked at the page. That you carry a sick child in a way that suggests you've decided the child is the only weight that matters, I said. And that you told me you needed one night without offering me anything in return, and that the asking of it cost you something, and you asked anyway. Sehane said nothing. And that your daughter, I said, makes real distinctions. The fire popped. A moth veered into the edge of the light and then veered away again. Are you a fair man? She asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely interrogative, the way you ask a question you actually want answered. I don't know, I said. I'm trying to be. That is a different thing, she said. I know, I said. The night stretched out around us, like something that had been waiting a long time to be witnessed. I wrote it down. Field log, Cutter's Ford, September 15, 1883, continued from preceding entry. I have not slept. I make a note of this not for sympathy, but because sleeplessness alters the quality of observation, and I want the record to reflect that what I write in the early hours of this morning is filtered through the particular clarity that comes just before exhaustion tips into delusion. Things seem very sharp and very simple before the fog rolls in. I am using this window. The fever broke at 3 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had been checking my watch every 20 minutes in the compulsive way I have when I'm trying to impose structure on a situation that doesn't want any. And at 3 o'clock, Sehane made a sound, not loud, almost no volume at all, more like a change in the quality of her breathing. And when I looked across the fire, she had her face pressed against the top of Nolly's head. The girl was sweating. Sweating is good. I knew that much. Fever breaking means sweating, and sweating means the body has decided to fight on the body's terms rather than the disease's. And I had been raised in a family where my mother treated every broken fever like a small military victory, which perhaps explains some things about my general approach to the world. I did not say anything. This was not my moment. Sehane sat with her daughter for a long time, her face still against Nolly's hair, very still in the way that people are still when they are not trying to be calm, but simply are calm, because the thing they were most afraid of has stepped back from the edge. Eventually, she raised her head. She looked across the fire at me. I looked back. She said nothing, and I said nothing because nothing needed saying, which is a kind of communication that I had not had in a very long time and which I found, unexpectedly, to be one of the more sustaining things I had experienced in recent memory. I wrote in my log, 3:04 a.m., fever broke. Both of them are going to be all right. Then I crossed out the second sentence and wrote it again. Both of them might be all right. Then I crossed that out too. What I finally wrote was 3:04 a.m. The girl sweated through the bedroll. Good. After that, the night changed texture. This is the only way I can describe it. The urgency, the coiled, breath-held quality that had been in the air since Sehane walked out of the Ford, relaxed somewhat, not completely. There was still too much unresolved for complete relaxation. But the tightest wire went slack, and what replaced it was something more manageable. Just two people at a fire, watching the sky get gradually less dark in the east, which is one of the oldest human activities there is. Sehane talked. Not in a rush. She was not the kind of person who released things in a rush. She talked the way she did everything, with deliberation, testing each sentence before setting it down, leaving space between them. But she talked, and I listened, and I wrote things down when she wasn't looking and hoped she understood when she was. She told me about the camp. Not the one that had ended, she didn't go directly there, but an older one from before, when she had been a child. A place north of the canyon system where there was a spring that didn't go dry even in August, and cottonwood trees along the water, and the specific quality of light in late afternoon that she described in a way that made me see it clearly even though I'd never been within 50 miles of the place. She told me about her husband without naming him. She didn't name him, and I did not ask, because there are conventions in how people approach certain absences, and I had enough sense to recognize one. She told me he had been good at fixing things. Not extraordinary things, ordinary things. Harness fittings, loose tent stakes. The kind of persistent small repairs that hold daily life together, and whose value you only fully understand when they stop being done. He could have fixed that, she said sometimes, when something came up. She said it in the way of a private joke that had kept its function after the person it was shared with was gone. I did not say I was sorry. I had learned, somewhere in my 30s, through the trial and error of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time to people who were grieving, that I'm sorry is what you say when you can't think of what else to say, and it is fine. It serves a function, but it is not the same as actually listening to what someone tells you about the person they lost. So I listened. I learned that Sehane had 3 sisters, 2 of whom she hadn't seen in over a year, that she had made Nolly's wool wrap herself from trade cloth and her own patient evening hours, that she had walked the 3 days carrying Nolly on her back not because she couldn't have fashioned a travois. She could have, but because the travois would have slowed her enough to matter, and also because she had not trusted herself to follow her own footprints if something happened, and she needed to run. Needed to run? She said it factually, the way you'd say in case of rain, planning language for a life in which running was a standing contingency. I sat with that for a while. I had been in the territory for 4 years by then. I had eaten meals in settlers' homes and listened to men talk about Apache people the way they talked about weather systems, something to be endured, managed, eventually redirected. I had told myself when I needed to that I was not personally responsible for the shape of the world I surveyed. I was just measuring it. Sitting at Cutter's Ford at 4 in the morning with a woman who planned her route based on where she could run if she had to, that argument felt significantly less persuasive than it usually did. "Do you hate us?" I asked. And immediately I heard how the question sounded, the enormous, self-centered weight of it, asking a woman who had just spent 3 days running with her sick child whether she hated the category of person responsible for that running. But Sehane didn't look offended. She looked thoughtful, which was worse because it meant she was actually considering it. "Hate is for people who think things could have been different," she said. "I think things were always going to be exactly like this." "That's a fatalistic view." "No," she said, "fatalism is despair. I am not despairing." She looked at Nolly, who was sleeping with the profound completeness of someone whose body has stopped fighting and started recovering. "I am just looking at what is." I turned my pencil end over end in my fingers, a habit my brother Emmett called maddening and which I have never managed to break. "What is?" I repeated. "You are here," she said. "That is also what is." I didn't know what to do with that. I wrote it down instead. Around 4:30, Sehane did something I was not prepared for. She reached into the wrapped bundle she'd been carrying alongside Nolly, not the girl's wool wrap, another bundle, smaller, tied with a cord, and she took out a small piece of worked leather. It was a cuff of some kind, stitched with a geometric pattern in what I thought at first was paint but was actually dyed thread, very fine work, the kind of patience required for which made my hands tired to contemplate. She held it for a moment, looking at it. Then she looked at me. "This was made by my sister," she said. "The oldest one she makes these for," she searched for the word, "for moments that need marking." She held it out across the fire. I looked at it. "I can't take that." "I know," she said. "It isn't a gift. It is a loan." "A loan of what?" "Of the idea," she said, "that someone on the other side of a large distance is making things worth keeping." I looked at her for a long time. Then I reached across the fire, carefully. It was low enough now, but it was still fire, and I took the cuff. I turned it over in my hands. The stitching was extraordinary. Each geometric shape connected to the next with a precision that suggested a mind that found satisfaction in things fitting together correctly, which is a kind of mind I understand. "I'll give it back," I said. "How do I give it back?" "You won't be able to," she said. "But you can keep it until you find a moment that also needs marking and leave it there." "That's not how loans work." "That is exactly how this kind does," she said. I looked at the cuff for another moment and then put it in my breast pocket, against my ribs, where I could feel the slight weight of it when I breathed. Just before 5, Nolly woke again. This time was completely different from midnight. She came up out of sleep slowly and looked around with the open-faced, slightly dopey quality of a child who has just had the specific kind of restorative sleep that follows a fever breaking, when the body has done its work and everything feels easier than it did. She looked at the fire, at me, at her mother. She said something. Sehane laughed, the first time I'd heard her laugh, short and genuine, the kind that surprises even the person doing it. "She says you still look lost," Sehane said. "Tell her that's a fair assessment," I said. Sehane translated. Nolly looked at me seriously, then reached into the bedroll and produced from somewhere, I have no idea where she'd been carrying it, a small piece of river-polished stone, black, about the size of a quail's egg. She held it out toward me across the fire with the solemnity of a formal presentation. I reached out and took it. "She gives these to people who need direction," Sehane said, and I could hear in her voice that she was keeping her face carefully neutral. "Does the stone give direction?" "No," Sehane said, "but having something to hold usually helps." Nolly looked satisfied. She lay back down and closed her eyes again with the particular decisiveness of someone who has accomplished what she set out to do. I held the stone in my palm. It was smooth and warm. She'd been sleeping with it, and heavier than it looked. I put it in my left breast pocket, on the same side as the cuff. My field log entry for that moment reads, 4:58 a.m. I have been given a stone and a loaned idea, and I am not sure what to do with either. The girl is better. The fire is lower. There is something happening here that I do not have the right word for. Below that I drew a small sketch of the stone. I was not then and am not now a good illustrator, but I wanted the shape of it recorded. The sky began to lighten. Not the sunrise, not yet. Just that preliminary shift in the dark, the first hesitant gray at the horizon that says, the night is considering ending. I have always found that particular moment to be one of the lonelier ones, because it's the time when the things you've said and thought and felt in the protected dark become things you're going to have to carry into the day. Sehane was watching it. "I need to move before full light," she said. "I know," I said. "The ford," she looked toward the water. "The ford is easy in daylight," I said. "The road south is clear." She looked at me. "You know that road." "I've surveyed it," I said. "The family you're going to, are they at the Delgado place? South Fork, stone walls." She looked at me with an expression I recognized as cautious surprise, the recalibration of a person who had made an assumption and found it didn't fit. "You know this family." "I know the land around it," I said. "I don't know them." I looked at my map, which I'd been carrying folded in my coat since yesterday and which was, professionally speaking, more accurate than anything else in a 40-mile radius. "There's a second crossing about 3 miles down, shallower, better for—" I nodded at Nolly, someone on someone's back. Sehane looked at the map, then at me. "I will not take the map," she said. "You're not taking it," I said. "I'm going to tell you what's on it." I spent 15 minutes describing the route from memory. The landmarks, the crossing, the place where the road bent south, and what the particular shape of the rock formation there looked like from the east. I described it the way you describe something to someone who is going to have to navigate by feel as much as by sight, with redundancies and reference points at different heights and times of day. She listened with her eyes half closed, the way people do when they're building an internal picture. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Then you are a very good describer." "It's literally my job," I said. "Most jobs," she said, "do not transfer like that." I didn't have an answer for that. Nolly was awake and sitting up, looking around with the alert interest of a child who has missed a great deal and is taking stock of what's been happening in her absence. She looked at me with the assessing gaze she had apparently decided was my appropriate permanent accompaniment, and then she looked at her mother and said something in a tone that was clearly a question. She asked, Sehane said, if you will be all right, alone. I was not expecting that. I opened my mouth to say something dismissive, something about being fine, being used to it, all the standard things you say, and then I stopped. Tell her, I said, that I have a stone now, and that usually helps. Sehane translated. Nolly looked at the pocket where I'd put the stone. Then she nodded once, with the gravity of someone who has just received confirmation of a hypothesis. End of Part 2, Field Log, Cutters Ford, Arizona Territory, September 15, 1883. Field Log, continuing, September 15, 1883. I debated whether to put what follows in the official survey log or keep it here in the personal record. I'm keeping it here. Some observations are not for general distribution. Some observations are for the man who made them, so he can look at them when he's old enough to need the reminder. They left at first light. I want to say there was ceremony to it, something formal, a moment that announced itself as significant. There wasn't. The light came up gray and honest over the canyon rim to the east, and Nolly finished the last of my hardtack with an efficiency that suggested she'd been hungry for some time, and had not wanted to be a further imposition. And Sehane wrapped her back into the wool cloth, and settled her weight onto her shoulders the way she had arrived, with the practiced ease of someone who has been carrying this particular weight so long it had become part of her center of gravity. She stood at the edge of the fire, which was down to gray-edged coals now, and looked at me. I stood on the other side of it. This is the part I have rewritten the most in my head over the following 40 years. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing dramatic happened, and the absence of drama in a moment that felt enormous has always seemed to me like something worth trying to understand. She didn't say thank you. I want to note that specifically. I have thought about it often enough that I feel certain it is worth noting. She didn't say thank you, and it wasn't rudeness. I would have bet the survey equipment on that by then. It was something more considered. Like thank you would have put us in a kind of transaction that cheapened the specific nature of what the night had been. Like she had decided, at some point between the Ford and first light, that what had happened here wasn't a debt to be acknowledged but something else. What she said was, you should fix the boot. I looked down at my right boot. I know, I said. Before you walk, she said, not after. Yes, I said. She looked at me for another moment. Then she said something in Apache, not translating it, not offering the English beside it. Just the words in the language they belonged to. Then she turned and walked south with Nolly on her back. And she did not look back, and Nolly looked back exactly once from over Sehane's shoulder and raised one small hand. I raised mine. They went around the bend in the creek where the cottonwoods grew dense and the path curved south, and that was that. I sat down. I'm not sure how long I sat there, long enough for the coals to go fully gray. Long enough for the canyon wrens to start their morning business in the rocks above the ford, which is a particular sound, descending, liquid, completely indifferent to human concerns, that I have associated with that morning ever since, every single time I've heard it in 30 years of field work. Then I opened my field log to the next clean page, and I wrote the date and the time, and then I wrote the words she'd said in Apache, phonetically, as best I could remember them, which was imperfect but honest. For years I carried that page with no translation. It wasn't until 1891, 8 years later in Tucson, when I was drinking bad coffee at a poor table and talking with a man who had been a translator at the San Carlos agency, that I finally asked someone to look at the phonetic transcription. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. "Where did you hear this?" he said. "A woman said it to me," I said, "a long time ago." He looked back at the page. "It says," he said, "approximately, the ground remembers every step, walk carefully." I sat with that for a while. He pushed the paper back across the table and drank his coffee and didn't ask anything else, because he was a man who understood when something had already said everything it needed to say. I found my horse 2 hours south of the ford, which was a mild vindication. The animal had given up on its principles and returned to the general vicinity of human company, as horses eventually do. The shale descent that had caused our disagreement the previous day looked significantly less threatening in morning light, which is true of most things. My right boot's blister had gotten significantly worse during the night of sitting, and was now making a fairly convincing argument for immediate attention. I sat on a flat rock and dealt with it with the materials I had, which weren't adequate but were what there was. While I was sitting there, I took the cuff out of my breast pocket. The morning light was better for looking at it than firelight had been. The stitching was even more precise than I'd thought. The geometric pattern wasn't random, I realized, but had a logic to it, each shape derived from the previous one by a consistent rule I couldn't fully articulate but could feel, like a mathematical proof rendered in thread. I turned it over. On the inside of the cuff, which I hadn't examined in the dark, there was a single line of smaller stitching in a different color, darker, almost black against the leather. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't decorative. It was writing. Not English, but not entirely unfamiliar. It was a phonetic rendering of an Apache phrase in a hand that had been taught to write Roman letters by someone patient. I added it to my field log beside the phrase I'd written the night before. The Tucson man in 1891 translated that one too without my asking, because he'd seen me looking at both entries. "Same page," he said, "different hands." He read it. "This one says, made for a long way." He pointed at the first phrase, say Haynes' words to me at the fire. "And this one, the one I gave you before, that one was added later. Recent thread, different age." He paused. "Someone else added that one after." I looked at the cuff in my hands. The sister had stitched a message inside it before she gave it to Tsehane, "Made for a long way." And then at some point, before the camp was broken or after, I'll never know, Tsehane had added the words she later spoke to me at the ford, into the inside of the cuff, with thread the color of dark water. "The ground remembers every step. Walk carefully." She hadn't said those words to me in the moment. Or rather, she had said them, but she had also stitched them before she said them, which means she had been carrying them already. They weren't improvised comfort at a stranger's fire. They were something she'd had with her, something she'd already decided to say. She just didn't know when she stitched them who she'd end up saying them to. I have thought about this on and off for 30 years. I have thought about it on survey trips in weather that had no business being surveyed in, when the practical question was survival, and the theoretical question was, what are we doing out here exactly? I have thought about it in the winter of '87, when I was briefly sick enough to consider the possibility that I might not be sick temporarily. And what I turned over in my mind in that window wasn't my professional accomplishments, but the specific weight of a smooth black stone in a breast pocket. I still have the stone. It is on my desk as I write this, next to the ink and the current year's field log and a cup of coffee that has gone cold. It is unremarkable to look at. It is, as I said, polished river basalt, approximately quail-egg-sized, black, with a slight warmth from being held that transfers itself to your palm and stays there for a while after. I gave the cuff away in 1887. I found the moment that needed marking. I won't go into the details here because they belong to someone else's story, but I left it with a young Navajo man at a way station outside of Flagstaff who had just lost something substantial and was sitting in the specific posture of someone who was figuring out how much of themselves remained. I put the cuff on the bench beside him without explanation and walked away, which is the correct way to pass on something that operates as a loan. I don't know if he kept it. I don't know if he understood what he was holding or just thought some stranger had left a piece of worked leather on a bench. I don't know if it helped. "Made for a long way," the sister had stitched inside it. I hope the words meant something to him. I hope he was, in fact, made for one. I never saw Tsehane again. I've looked over the years, not obsessively, but in the way a person checks for something they've been thinking about when they happen to be in the relevant vicinity. I've asked questions in the right places at the right times, careful about how I phrased them, because asking the wrong question about Apache people in the territory in certain years was asking to receive information that I did not want. I found out indirectly around 1888 that the family at the Stonewall place south of Cutter's Ford had indeed taken in a girl child around the time I'd have expected. That the girl had been sick and had recovered, that she had stayed. I found out nothing else. There are things I have told myself about what that means and things I have refused to tell myself, because some silences are more honest than the stories you could fill them with. What I know is this. A woman walked out of a river at night with her daughter on her back and asked for one thing, not rescue, not justice, not for the history of the previous decade to be different than it was. One night, a fire, stillness enough for a fever to break. And I, a man who had spent 4 years measuring the land that was being taken from people like her, telling himself the measurements were neutral, happened to be sitting there when she crossed. I had the choice that every person has, in the specific moment when history stops being something that happens to other people and requires a response. I could be the man who pointed the rifle, or I could be the man who put it down. I put it down. I want to be clear that I am not writing this account because putting the rifle down makes me a hero. It doesn't. It makes me a man who, on one night, did the basic minimum that decency required, and then sat at a fire and learned more in 6 hours than I had managed to understand in the previous decade of living in the same landscape as people I had barely looked at directly. The heroism, if that word belongs anywhere in this account, belongs to a woman who walked 3 days on a bleeding heel with a sick child on her back and still had the precision at the end of it to distinguish between being lost and being turned around. It belongs to a 6-year-old girl who gave her last smooth stone to a stranger because she decided he needed direction more than she did. It belongs to a sister, name unknown, who stitched made for a long way into the inside of a leather cuff before she knew who would need to read it. I am 62 years old. My hands shake in the mornings. My right boot, not the same one, obviously, but the current one, has a blister on the lateral heel that I have been meaning to address for 3 days and keep forgetting. The stone is on my desk. The log is almost full. I have 1 clean page left after this one, which seems like it means something, though I am old enough to distrust meaning that arrives conveniently. What I'll write on it when I figure out the right first sentence is something about what I've learned, not in the 30 years since the Ford, but in the 6 hours at the Ford, which were, if I'm accounting carefully, the most instructive 6 hours of my professional and personal life combined. I've been trying to find the right sentence for 30 years. What I have so far is this. The ground remembers every step. The rest of it I'm still working on.